This is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This special edition of AR features Noam Chomsky and Edward Said on U.S. Middle East policy. This rare joint appearance was recorded at Columbia University on April 9, 1999, before an overflow audience. Chomsky, MIT professor, and Said, who teaches at Columbia, are two of the leading activist scholars in the world today. Alternative Radio, since its inception, has made a special effort to record Noam Chomsky and Edward Said. To get a free audio cassette catalog, just call us at 1-800-444-1977 or by email ar@orci.com. Akil Bilgrami, professor of philosophy at Columbia, introduces the program.
How does it happen that a professor, as it might be of linguistics and philosophy, or of English and comparative literature, puts aside his protected comforts and the many potential rewards and applause for intellectual achievements to seek out far-reaching unpopularity, both among his academic colleagues and the world outside, by speaking out with rigor and detail and evidence against the evils that states do with the systematic support of corporations and the media. I don't know how this happens. In this age of psychobabble, one is no doubt supposed to do better than merely to point to such things as their courage and commitment, but I'm not going to try and do better now. One thing we do know is that we have two such people with us. They are, along with such past figures as Bertrand Russell and E.P. Thompson, the heroes of our time. And they have come here to speak about a region, if not of the most visible and dramatic conflict today, nevertheless a site of chronic conflict arising from abiding injustices. The format of this meeting will be roughly as follows. Noam Chomsky and Edward Said will speak first, each for about half an hour, and then we'll speak to each other for about 15 minutes while we all eavesdrop. And then they've agreed to take questions from the floor. So I just want to say that it's really tremendous to have them both here. And I'm going to ask them to come now onto the platform, and Noam Chomsky will speak first and Edward second. Please welcome.
I have a stopwatch, but your task is to stop me if I go on too long, as I tend to do. The core issue in the Middle East is very straightforward, namely oil. Since World War I, when the world began to move on to an oil-based economy, the Middle East has become central in world affairs for the very obvious reason that it has by far the largest and the most accessible petroleum resources, primarily in Saudi Arabia, secondarily in Iraq, and thirdly in the Gulf Emirates and elsewhere. It is, as the State Department described it during the Second World War, when the U.S. was taking over, it's a stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history. It's strategically the most important part of the world, as the president of Columbia University described it as he was making his transition from Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe to Supreme Commander of the world in the White House, which I guess says something about Columbia's rank in world order. The smaller, more expensive reserves like North Sea and Alaska are declining. The role of the Middle East in the world energy system is accordingly increasing, and it'll become critical probably in the not too distant future if, as is widely anticipated, the current oil glut proves to be temporary, which is not unlikely. The rate of discovery has been declining since the 1960s, despite high technology and deep-sea drilling and so on. And the usage of energy has been sharply increasing. In fact, about half of the total usage in history is since the oil price rise in the early 1970s, and it's going up. It's expected that the magic halfway point, as it's called, when half of the known accessible resources are used, is coming fairly soon. All of this spells crisis. It's possible, of course, that some unpredictable breakthrough will take place and things will change, but policy planning is not based on unpredictable technological breakthroughs. So we can pretty confidently expect that the United States will continue, as in the past, to do everything it can to make sure that the greatest material prize in world history remains firmly in its hands. Well, the United States took over from Britain in the Middle East, and in fact much of the world, after the Second World War, actually replaced Britain and France. France was summarily expelled. They weren't given the time of day. Britain, however, was given a role. It was given a role of junior partner, as the British Foreign Office rather ruefully described it accurately. Britain was going to be our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner, as they were described by a senior advisor of the Kennedy administration. The U.S., that's reasonably accurate. Actually, you're seeing an example of it right now. The lieutenant is doing its job. Attack dog, maybe. The United States inherited from Britain the modalities of control of the region as well. These modalities had changed during and after World War I, when Britain was no longer had the force to rule the empire directly by occupation, and therefore had to turn to air power and high technology, advanced technology. So it was explained pretty frankly. The distinguished statesman Lloyd George, he's commenting on Britain's success in undermining a disarmament conference which would have barred the use of air power against civilians. He pointed out that that was a success because, as he put it, we have to reserve the right to bomb the niggers, which kind of sums up world affairs rather nicely. Winston Churchill, who was then the Secretary of State at the War Office, was a great enthusiast for using advanced technology to achieve the same end. His favorite was poison gas. He said that back in the early 20s that poison gas would be a fine weapon, he thought, against uncivilized tribesmen and recalcitrant Arabs. That's referring to Kurds and Afghans at the time, but they apparently qualified. He said it should inspire a lively terror. You recall that poison gas was the ultimate atrocity in those days. And he said that this is simply the use of it's an application of Western science to military warfare, to measures of warfare. Therefore, we shouldn't back off from it. Well, those were the military tactics. They've had a distinguished career ever since. On the political side, Britain, we know from the British Foreign Office records, Colonial Office records, which have been declassified, they developed a system which, in fact, the U.S. has taken over. The idea was that the oil-producing states would be administered by what the British called secretly, of course, what they called an Arab facade, constitutional fictions behind which Britain would continue to rule. Now, the facade has to be weak because it has to be dependable, has to do what you tell it. But then there's a problem, because if the facade is weak, it may not be able to control its own population. And its own population is uncivilized and ignorant. They do not understand that they can be easily infected by what's called a virus of radical nationalism, which was defined by the State Department back in the 1940s as the belief that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources ought to be the people of that country. And that, of course, is intolerable because any sane and civilized person can understand that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources have to be wealthy investors in the United States and so on. So these people just don't understand that, and they're always causing trouble. They're uncivilized tribesmen and so on, and sometimes poison gas doesn't work. So you have to have some way of keeping the Arab facade in power. And to do that, as the U.S. developed the system, there's two levels of violence required. Actually, this is all over the world. I mean, much of the history of the last half century is the playing out of this issue in Southeast Asia and Latin America and the Middle East and all over. It's not put that way, but that's the way it is. In the Middle East, the way it was worked out is that there are to be what the Nixon administration called local cops on the beat. That is, local gendarmes who sort of keep order in the neighborhood. And it's best to have them be non-Arab. They do better at killing recalcitrant Arabs. So there's a periphery of, in fact, what David Ben-Gurion, Israeli prime minister, called the periphery policy of non-Arab states, Iran under the Shah, Turkey, Israel, Pakistan. They're there to be the local cops on the beat. The understanding, of course, is that police headquarters remains in Washington, and if things really get out of hand, the local cops on the beat can't handle it. There's British and U.S. muscle and reserve to be used when needed. That's essentially the modality of control. The Central Command, as it's now called, which was initiated by Carter as the Rapid Deployment Force, is the major U.S. intervention force by far in the world. And it's an enormous force. It's based from Guam to the Azores, even with bases in the Indian Ocean, where the junior partner was kind enough to drive out the population of an island so that U.S. bases could be put in there, all aimed at the core area, the Middle East intervention forces. In 1980, when the Carter administration was explaining this to Congress, they pointed out that the problem wasn't the Russians. In fact, this was after the invasion of Afghanistan, but they realized that's not the problem. The problem is regional unrest. That is the virus of radical nationalism. Well, that's essential, and that remains the case. So as for the Russians, we don't have to argue about it anymore. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Bush administration, in a very important and therefore unreported declaration to Congress, explained that everything has to remain exactly the same military budget, everything, including the intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, where, as they put it, the threat to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. I mean, sorry guys, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now there's no Kremlin, so let's be straight. The threat to our interests is regional unrest, and we got to control it. Incidentally, notice that the threat to our interests could not be laid at Iraq's door either. At that point, Saddam Hussein was a great friend and ally. It's true, he had gassed Kurds and tortured dissidents and massacred people and so on, but he hadn't yet committed any crimes. The crime was disobedience. That's a crime. That came a couple of months later. But at that point, he was a great friend and ally, and the U.S. continued to support him right through these things that maybe you and I would call crimes. It's interesting to hear, just to switch to another period, like right now when the U.S. and its attack dog bomb Iraq. The line that you hear from Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright and other distinguished figures is that we have to do this. How can we let such a creature survive? He even committed the ultimate crime, gassing his own population. Their willingness to say that over and over expresses extraordinary trust in the educated classes in England and the United States, who they trust not to say what everyone knows, that can't possibly be the reason, because we supported Saddam right through those atrocities and continue to increase the support after it. But their trust is warranted, as you can tell by looking at the press and commentary. Going back here, If you look at the structure of the system of control, you can determine very quickly how policy works. Participants have rights which are commensurate with their role in the system. So the United States has rights by definition. The junior partner has rights as long as it stays loyal. Same with the Arab facade, and the same with the local gendarmes. What about the peasants in Iraq or people in the slums of Cairo? Well, they don't contribute to the system, so they have no rights. What about the Palestinians? Well, they actually have negative rights. The reason is that they're a disruptive element. The fact that they were displaced arouses nationalist feelings and causes problems for the facade and the gendarmes and the attack dog. So therefore, their rights are negative. Well, from these are just kind of elementary principles of statecraft. You master those, you can predict very easily the way policy develops, and it works quite well. The end of the Cold War changed nothing, and that was well understood. So one of the leading Israeli strategic analysts, formerly head of military intelligence, Shlomo Gazit, about a year after the end of the Cold War, wrote that Israel's main task has not changed at all, and it remains of central importance. Israel remains of central importance as the devoted guardian of stability in the region. Its role is to protect the existing regimes, namely the facade, to prevent radicalization. That's accurate. You have to do a little translation. So stability means U.S. control, and Israel is the devoted guardian of the control of the master, and it's amply paid for its service. Radicalism means misunderstanding of who the first beneficiaries of a country's resources are. And fundamentalist religious zealotry does not, our opposition to that does not entail that we have to say bomb Saudi Arabia or bomb Jerusalem or bomb most of the United States, which is the most extreme, radical, fundamentalist religious state in the world, I suppose. Rather, what it means is this is a code word, which means the particular forms of radicalization, that is, failure to understand who the first beneficiaries are, the particular forms of radicalization that happen to take a religious cast when secular nationalism is destroyed. That's a pretty common pattern. But if you make the translations, what Gazit was saying was certainly accurate. Well, U.S.-Israeli relations developed in that context. So in 1948, the U.S. military was quite impressed by Israel's military actions. They were described a couple of days ago in Israel's leading paper, Haaretz, by a good reporter, as being Kosovo without TV cameras. Approximately accurate. In 1949, the U.S. Army planners concluded, I'm quoting, that Israel had demonstrated by the force of arms its right to be considered the military power next to Turkey in the Near and the Middle East. In 1958, the U.S. intelligence concluded that it's a logical corollary of opposition to radical Arab nationalism to support Israel as the only reliable U.S. ally in the region. Actually, 1958 was a very important year in modern history. The U.S. was facing three major crises at that time. They were described in now declassified records by Eisenhower and Dulles at the National Security Council. They said the U.S. is facing three major crises: Indonesia, North Africa, and the Middle East. They also, Eisenhower and Dulles both explained vociferously, according to the notes, that there was no Russian involvement in any of them. Well, these are all, of course, Islamic countries, maybe like an early illustration of the clash of civilizations. But that was irrelevant. I mean, they could have come from Mars. The crucial thing about those three regions is they were all oil producers. And the concern over them was interrelated, having to do with the threat to U.S. domination of oil production in the Middle East and maybe use of Indonesia as a temporary substitute. And there were very significant actions that took place, among them the destruction of Indonesian democracy. The U.S. carried out a huge clandestine operation to try to break up Indonesia, to separate off the outlying islands, the ones that are the oil producers. That had all kinds of consequences. In the Middle East, the U.S. landed troops in Lebanon, armed apparently with authorization to use nuclear weapons, according to high U.S. officials. It was a serious matter. The concern at that point was Iraq. Iraq had broken the Anglo-American condominium over oil. And remember, it's the second largest producer, a military coup which the U.S. regarded as Nasserite in inspiration, had sort of pulled the country out of the system, and that caused real hysteria. I won't have time to go into it now. I'll talk about it if you like, but the British Foreign Secretary flew to the United States immediately, and they laid plans which are extremely revealing. They explained just about everything that was going on in 1990 and 91, almost verbatim. Anyhow, it was taken pretty seriously. That's 1958. In the early 1960s, there was a proxy war going on between Nasser and Nasser was considered the heart of the rot, the source of radical nationalism. And there was a kind of a proxy war going on between Nasser and Saudi Arabia, the main oil producer, which was very threatening. In 1967, Israel intervened and smashed Nasser, and that was a major contribution. The U.S.-Israeli alliance was solidified. After the Israeli military victory, Israel also became the darling of American intellectuals, going from far right to left liberal, which is an interesting phenomenon about the United States, but its consequences show up mostly in the coverage of these events and the discussion about them. In 1970, Israel again proved that it's a devoted guardian. The U.S. needed it to intervene to prevent possible Syrian involvement, to try to block Jordan, which was then massacring Palestinians, and Israel did intervene and barred that, and that was considered a very welcome contribution. U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled at that point. In 1979, when the Shah fell, Israel's role simply increased. One of the main guardians was gone. That's actually the origins of what's falsely described as the arms for hostage deal began at that time. There were no hostages. It's completely different. But anyhow, it did solidify the alliance further. Well, going back to 67, that war was dangerous. Well, quote Secretary McNamara, I was then Secretary of Defense, we damn near had war, he said, with the Russians. There was an actual confrontation between the Russian and American navies in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was realized that we better quiet things down. So there was a diplomatic settlement worked out under the initiative of the United States and its junior partner. That's the famous UN 242. UN 242, November 1967, basically called for full peace in return for full Israeli withdrawal. Notice that UN 242 is completely rejectionist. That's very crucial for understanding what's happening now. It offered nothing to the Palestinians, just with agreement among states. So full peace in return for full withdrawal. There was a deadlock. The Arab states refused full peace. Israel refused full withdrawal. That deadlock was broken in February 1971. At that point, President Sadat of Egypt offered full peace to Israel for only partial withdrawal, namely withdrawal from Egyptian territory. Well, the U.S. kind of had an internal problem at that time. It was a bureaucratic battle that went on. It was won by Henry Kissinger, who preferred force, what he called stalemate, no negotiations. So he refused Sadat's offer. He took over, a very important date. That terminated U.S. support for UN 242. Since that time, the United States has not supported it, contrary to what you read, because it has reinterpreted to mean partial withdrawal, as the United States and Israel determined. Israel, at that point, this was a period of enormous triumphalism, which Kissinger shared. He thought Egypt was kind of a basket case. And his ignorance and stupidity, which are really colossal when you look at the documents, are led directly to the 1973 war, which did demonstrate that Egypt wasn't a basket case. You had to pay some attention to it. That even got through the clouds to Kissinger. He then undertook shuttle diplomacy, and the plans at that point were to try, since you can't forget about Egypt, let's eliminate it. It's the major Arab military force. Let's remove it from the conflict so that then Israel can proceed with U.S. support to integrate the territories and attack Lebanon. That's policy which then reached it, was concluded at Camp David. That's known in the United States as the peace process. And that, in fact, exactly what happened. U.S. support for Israel reached 50% of total aid at that point. Well, meanwhile, there was a shift in the international consensus going on. It was shifting away from pure rejectionism towards recognition of Palestinian rights. Now, that became a crisis in another crucial date, namely January 1976, when the Security Council debated a resolution which included UN 242, all of its wording, but also called for a Palestinian state in the territories that Israel was to leave under 242. Well, that was supported by the whole world, virtually. The Arab states, PLO, Russians, Europe, Latin America, everybody, except the one state that counts, which vetoed it. So the U.S. vetoed that resolution, and it's also vetoed from history. You might try to search for it. But it was a very crucial date. At that point, the U.S. became doubly rejectionist in a strong sense. No 242 and no Palestinian rights. Alone in the world, virtually, except for Israel. Well, then matters continued. Things shifted over to the General Assembly. There were almost annual votes of a similar nature, usually like 150 to 2 or something like that. There were initiatives from Europe, from the Arab states, from the PLO, all rejected by the United States. The leading journals, like, say, the New York Times, refused even to publish most of them, even letters referring to them. All of this is what's called the peace process again. That continued until 1990. The last General Assembly vote was December 1990, 144 to 2. Then came the Gulf War. The Gulf War established, as George Bush put it, the Gulf War established that what we say goes, and you better understand it. It was understood. So what we say goes. The U.S. returned to its support for its old friend Saddam while he murdered Shiites and Kurds. Since then has been turning to a rather rational policy of destroying Iraqi society. That's highly rational, especially for an oil-producing state. If you destroy the society and the population, there's much less concern that the first beneficiaries might be the people of the region because they're not going to be able to ask for anything. So the policy that's going on now of basically mass murder is a very reasonable policy, particularly for an oil producer. With regard to the Israel-Arab problem, the Israel-Palestinian problem, the U.S. immediately moved on to Madrid, fall of 1991. The Madrid conference met all U.S. conditions. First, it was unilateral. No interference from Europeans or anyone else. Secondly, it was totally rejectionist. So the U.S. could ram through its rejectionist program. That was the official program. Actually has yet to be reported in the United States, as far as I'm aware, in the mainstream, that is. But it was the Baker Plan. The Baker Plan, which simply endorsed the Shamir-Peres Plan, which stated that there cannot be an additional Palestinian state. Additional because there already is one, namely Jordan. So there can be no additional Palestinian state, and the fate of the territories has to be settled according to the guidelines of the State of Israel. That was the official U.S. program endorsing the Shamir-Peres Consensus, which was instituted at Madrid. We then move on to Oslo, September 1993. The Declaration of Principles was signed. And it was an enormous victory for the United States. Remember, I don't know if you've looked at it, but you should look at what it said. It didn't say much, but it said something. It described the permanent settlement, that is the long-term end goal, which must be achieved. And that must be strictly UN 242, not the other UN resolutions, which called for Palestinian rights alongside of Israel. And of course, UN 242 means the U.S. interpretation of it, which rejects UN 242. So the permanent settlement is doubly rejectionist. No Palestinian rights, no UN 242. Israeli withdrawal, just as the U.S. and Israel decide. the U.S. and Israel had decided they were pursuing a program that was called the Alon Plan that the Israeli labor government instituted in 1968, which essentially, it's varied a little bit over the years, but the basic idea is that Israel keeps roughly 40% of the occupied territories, the resources, primarily water, the usable land, the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which are mostly in the West Bank, and part of the Gaza Strip they want, and so on. And the rest sort of, can leave to the recalcitrant Arabs, the uncivilized tribesmen. That's changed a little bit over the years. Right now, it's a little different. Netanyahu calls for what he calls Alon Plus, so the Alon Plan plus a little bit more. His opponent, the Labor Party, Barak, he calls for an expanded Alon Plan. Those are the two political groupings in Israel, either Alon Plus or an expanded Alon Plan. One political commentator in Haaretz again says that one listens to the ideas of Barak and hears the voice of Netanyahu, kind of paraphrasing a biblical passage. And the U.S. supports it, of course. After Oslo, the Rabin and Peres immediately moved to expand settlement and development. Took over about 30% of the Gaza Strip, most of its meager resources. In the West Bank, the most crucial part of the development is the area which is called Greater Jerusalem. Greater Jerusalem is, it's a huge area. It extends from Ramallah to Bethlehem and as far east as Jericho. And since Israel's keeping the Jordan Valley, it effectively breaks up the West Bank into two cantons. There are other developments which break it into further ones. The Oslo II, September 1995, spells all of this out further. There's a Palestinian Authority which can sort of run affairs in downtown Nablus. And then there's roughly 100, actually more than 100 scattered Palestinian settlements separated from one another and crucially isolated from the economic, cultural, even medical center in Jerusalem, centers of Palestinian life. There are the Jewish areas are connected by superhighways. You can drive through them and not even know there are any Palestinians. Then there are things which are officially called Palestinian roads. Actually, I drove one not long ago from Bethlehem to Ramallah. I mean, if you make it alive, you're lucky. If it's raining, very lucky. Those are the Palestinian roads which interconnect the Palestinian settlements. Well, somebody's got to manage the Palestinian population. Okay, that's where Yasser Arafat and the PLO come in. That's a gangster regime based on robbery and brutality. The managers of it are to enrich themselves and to suppress the locals. The more brutally they do it, the more they're applauded by Al Gore and Bill Clinton. That's the central content of the Y Accords. The CIA is now there to supervise and make sure it works right. This should not surprise anyone. This is an absolutely typical colonial pattern. That's the way the British ran the Raj. That's the way the U.S. runs Central America. It's just standard. Now it's being carried over to this case. Well, the goals have been perfectly obvious for years to anybody with eyes open. It takes real dedication to miss them. And remember that these are the plans of the labor doves, even if the voice is Netanyahu's. I was in Israel not too long ago giving talks about this, and I started by just reading a paragraph from a standard history of South Africa in the early 1960s, at the time when they were setting up the first homelands, Transkei. It's kind of late, so I'll skip the paragraph unless you want me to read it. But the point is that I didn't have to comment. You read the paragraph about the establishment of Transkei, and everybody could recognize what's happening right outside their door. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the position of the doves. Now, there are differences between Rabin, Peres, two heroes, and Netanyahu, the villain. A number of differences, contrary to the comment in the Israeli press. Rabin and Peres were adamantly opposed to allowing the Palestinians to call whatever they got a state. On the other hand, Netanyahu has been more ambiguous. So his minister of communications and policy, director of communications and policy planning, David Bar-Ilan, recently said that, well, if the Palestinians want to call these scattered areas a state, we won't mind. In fact, if they want, they can call it fried chicken, he said, elegantly. That's, there's a little difference between the two. There's also a difference of style. The style of is important, and the style reflects their constituencies. Labor is the party of the rich. It's the party of the professionals, the westernized secular elements. Likud, the other party grouping, is the party of the poor, working people, Oriental Jews, religious, and so on. And those divisions do reflect themselves in the style by which they behave. So labor is much more attuned to the norms of Western hypocrisy, and they do things in the way they know the West is going to like. So they have spokesmen like, say, Abba Eban, who knows how to put in nice phrases, things like beating people up and smashing them and so on and so forth. Likud tends to be much more brazen and offensive to the West because we don't like it. It hurts our humanistic instincts to have to face what we're doing. Shimon Peres's housing minister pointed out correctly that he says labor builds quietly. That's what he said as he was announcing the plans for construction in what Israel calls Har Choma, which was later implemented by Netanyahu and blamed on him because it broke up the peace negotiations, but initiated by labor, except that they build quietly. So therefore, in the West, you can pretend they're not doing it. That is a difference, and that's why the West much prefers labor, always has, doesn't like Likud. Well, when you go to and it reflects itself in U.S. coverage. So if you go to the sort of dovish pro-Palestinian extreme of mainstream coverage, say Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, he has a typical article denouncing the bad Netanyahu and contrasting him with the saintly Rabin, who, quoting now, with sheer intellectual honesty, was willing to sign the Oslo Agreement, while Netanyahu, I'm quoting, opposes any solution that would give the Palestinians a viable state, tiny, disarmed, poor, dominated by Israel, but their own. And he says that's the heart of the matter. That's the crucial difference between the saintly Rabin and the bad Netanyahu. Actually, his facts are wrong. Netanyahu is more forthcoming about a Palestinian state. And the current differences between the Alon Plus and the expanded Alon plan. That is two forms of the South African homeland's policy at the worst moments, the deepest moments of South African apartheid. So what we can say then, looking at our own society, is that the extreme left-wing, dovish, pro-Palestinian end, they're rising to the level of the depths of South African apartheid, maybe, because this is a sympathetic interpretation. Just recently, Hillary Clinton, as you know, expressed her interest in running for the Senate in New York, and the New York Times had a story headlined, "New York's Palestinian State," and it condemned what they called the monumental political gaffe of Hillary Clinton, who had said a couple of years ago that the territory the Palestinians currently inhabit, what she meant is the territories they're allowed to administer, and whatever they might get in peace negotiations, should evolve into a functioning modern state that is a state that is tiny, disarmed, poor, dominated by Israel, but their own. And that was a terrible political gaffe, and the White House very quickly disowned those dangerous thoughts, and she was denounced all over the place, but she also got some support. So the Times quoted a political science professor who supported her and said, "Supporting a Palestinian state used to be the peacenik position, the extreme left-wing position, but now maybe no more. Like now maybe we can move forward up to the stand of the worst South African racists 35 years ago, and we can no longer condemn that as the peacenik extreme left-wing position. So our moral and intellectual culture may be making real progress and sooner or later may reach the depths of South Africa, although we can't be sure." These are all comments about us, not about the situation there. Is there a way out of all of this? Well, you know, when you grow up, you're supposed to become more mature. That's what they tell you, but I think I'm missing a gene or something. I still believe what I thought when I was a teenage Zionist youth activist more than almost 60 years ago. At that time, as a Zionist youth activist, I was strongly opposed to a Jewish state, which was called a Zionist position at that time. Now it's an anti-Zionist position, same position. The meaning of the word has changed. And the reasons were pretty straightforward. A democratic Jewish state is an absolute contradiction in terms. You can try to pretend circles or squares if you like, but it won't work. It's a contradiction in terms. Furthermore, a Jewish state, it was clear, was going to exacerbate conflicts and tensions. And thirdly, it was going to destroy the attractive elements in the existing societies, which were quite real. They're not going to survive a state and ethnic conflict. And there was an alternative. The alternative, which was then a Zionist position, was some kind of binationalist federation, recognizing that there are two national groups involved, moving towards closer integration as circumstances permit, on the basis of cooperation between people across national lines, which are not the only lines in the world. So on the basis of common class interests or cultural interests or other interests. Well, 1948, that became academic. In 1967, it became realistic. At that point, Israel controlled the whole region. It could have instituted a regime of that sort with no opposition. In fact, would have been welcomed. I actually suggested it a lot that time. That led to extreme denunciations, particularly from Israeli doves, including, I'm sorry to say, old friends. And the reason was it was a period of enormous triumphalism in Israel and the United States. Nobody wanted to hear anything. So that was gone. But after 1973, that opportunity was lost. There was a window of opportunity from 67 up to the 73 war. It was lost. Now it's conceivable that it's realistic again. It should be obvious to any sane person that there is no two-state settlement other than the South African Transkei settlement. And it's kind of interesting, I don't know exactly what it means, that this traditional Zionist idea that I just described, out on the on the fringe, I don't want to say it was the mainstream, it's being revived a little bit in Israel with what significance one may debate. The important point for us is that the attitude the United States takes is decisive, as always. Whatever happens here is decisive. Doesn't determine everything, but overwhelmingly determines what happens there. It's the one factor that's under our control, and that may perhaps offer a gleam of light in the general darkness if we choose to do something about it.
Not to hold back my conclusion, which is roughly the same as Noam's, I want to say also that my feeling is that the two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is I think, a hopeless one, and some form of binationalism, which I'll try to get to at the end of my comments, seems to me to be the only hope, and hence the reason for talking about it more in this country. I've just come back a couple of weeks ago from a trip where I spent some time in Israel, as well as, of course, in the Palestinian territories, and spoke about this to some degree of response from Israelis. I mean Israeli Jews, and of course Israeli Palestinians. But what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the importance, the continuing importance of 1948 for the present moment. And in a sense, I want to talk about something quite different than what you've heard from Noam Chomsky. That is to say, I want to talk about the Palestinian experience as a human, evolving human thing, trajectory, and how it feeds into the current impasse and where it might, if looked at honestly within the Arab and international context, might give one some hope for the future, which I think is the most important thing. I might as well begin by speaking personally about 1948, particularly at a moment when the media is focusing so much on the faces and the bodies and general appalling plight of Kosovar refugees. and what it meant for many of the people around me. My own immediate family was spared the worst ravages of what we call the catastrophe of Nakba of 1948. We had a house and my father a business in Cairo, so even though we were in Palestine during most of 1947, when we left in December of that year, the wrenching, cataclysmic quality of the collective experience, when 780,000 Palestinians, two-thirds of the population, were literally driven out of the country by the Zionist forces of the time. This was not one we had to go through in as traumatic a form as most others did. I was 12 at the time, so I had only a somewhat attenuated and certainly no more than a semi-conscious awareness of what was happening. Only this narrow awareness was available to me, but I do distinctly recall some things with special lucidity. One was that every member of my family on both sides became a refugee during the period. No one remained in our Palestine, that is, that part of the mandatory territory controlled by the British Mandate. That didn't include the West Bank, which was in 1948 annexed to Jordan. Therefore, those of my relatives who lived in cities like Jaffa, Safad, Haifa, and West Jerusalem, which is where I was born, were suddenly made homeless, in many instances penniless, disoriented, and scarred forever. I saw most of them again after the fall of Palestine, but all were greatly reduced in circumstances, their faces stark with worry, ill health, despair. My extended family lost all its property and residence, and like so many Palestinians of the time, bore the travail not so much as a political, but as a natural tragedy. This etched itself on my memory with lasting results, mostly because of the faces, which I had once remembered as content and at ease, but which were now aligned with the cares of exile and homelessness, which is the condition of most Palestinians today. Many families and individuals had their lives broken, their spirits drained, their composure destroyed forever in the context of seemingly unending serial dislocation. This was and still is for me of the greatest poignancy. One of my uncles went from Palestine to Alexandria to Cairo to Baghdad to Beirut, and now in his 80s lives a sad, silent man in Seattle. Neither he nor his immediate family ever truly recovered. This is emblematic of the larger story of loss and dispossession which continues today. And I think it ought to be mentioned that ever since 1948, the United Nations, just as NATO is saying today, and the United States along with it, ever since 1948, the United States, with the United Nations, has voted a yearly resolution saying that the Palestinians can go back. The second thing I recall was that for the one person in my family who somehow managed to pull herself together in the aftermath of the catastrophe, my aunt, Palestine meant service to the unfortunate refugees, many thousands of whom ended up penniless, jobless, destitute, and disoriented in Egypt. She devoted her life to them in the face of government obduracy and sadistic indifference. From her, I learned that whereas everyone was willing to pay lip service to the cause, to the humanitarian cause, only a very few people were willing to do anything about it. As a Palestinian, therefore, she took it as her lifelong duty to set about helping the refugees. This is in the days before UNICEF and USAID and all of those other things, getting children into schools, getting them doctors, giving them treatment and medicine, finding the men jobs, and so on and so forth. She remains an exemplary figure for me, a person against whom any effort thereafter is always measured and always found wanting. The job for us in my lifetime was to be literally unending. It's now 51 years. And because it derives from a human tragedy so profound, so extraordinary, and saturating both the formal as well as the informal life of its people, down to the smallest detail, has been and will continue to be recalled, testified, remedied. For Palestinians, a vast collective feeling of injustice continues to hang over our lives with undiminished weight. If there's been one thing, one particular delinquency committed by the present group of Palestinian leaders for me, it is their gifted power of forgetting. When one of them was asked recently, this appeared on the front page of the New York Times last October, what he felt about Ariel Sharon's accession to Israel's foreign ministry, given that Sharon was responsible for the shedding of so much Palestinian blood, this leader said blithely, "We are prepared to forget history." And this is a sentiment I neither can share nor, I hasten to add, easily forgive. It's therefore important to recall what Israelis themselves have said about the country they conquered in 1948. Here's Moshe Dayan, 1969, April, just about 30 years ago today. We came to this country which is already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew that is a Jewish state here. In considerable areas of the country, the total area of the country that he's talking about, it was only 6%. We bought the lands from the Arabs. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You don't even know, he was talking to an Israeli audience, you don't even know the names of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. In the events of 1948, 400 villages were destroyed and effaced from history. Nahalal, which is Dayan's own village, he says, arose in the place of Mahalul, Givat in the place of Jipta, Kibbutz Sered in the place of Hanifs, and Kefar Yehoshua in the place of Tel Shamman. There's not, this is the last sentence of his intervention, there's not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. Looking back on the reactions in the aftermath of 1948, what strikes me now is how largely unpolitical they were, as it must be the case for people going through what some of the refugees are going through today. For 20 years after 1948, Palestinians were immersed in the problems of everyday life, with little time left over for organizing, analyzing, and planning. Israel, to most Arabs, for at least 20 years after 48, and to Palestinians, except for those who remained, was a cipher, its language unknown, its society unexplored, its people and the history of their movement largely confined to slogans, catch-all phrases, negation. We saw and experienced its cruelty towards us, but it took us a long while to understand what we saw and what we experienced. The overall tendency throughout the Arab world, and this is one of the most important consequences of 1948, as I'm sure it will be in regions of the world that are going through the same process today, is that a vast militarization took over every society almost without exception, as it did also take over Israel. In the Arab world, military coups succeeded each other more or less unceasingly. And worse yet, every advance in the military idea brought an equal and opposite diminution in social, political, and economic democracy. Looking back on it now, the rise to hegemony of Arab nationalism allowed for very little in the way of democratic civil institutions, mainly because the concepts and the language of that nationalism devoted little attention to the role of democracy in the evolution of these societies. Until now, the presence of a putative danger to the Arab world has engendered a permanent deferral of such things as an open press, unpoliticized universities, or freedoms to research, travel in, and explore new realms of knowledge. No massive investment was ever made in the quality of education, despite on the whole successful policies by some governments, including the Egyptian government, to lower the rate of illiteracy. It was thought that given the perpetual state of emergency caused by Israel, such matters, which could only be the result of long-range planning and reflection, were luxuries that were ill-afforded. Instead, arms procurement on a huge scale took the place of genuine human development, with negative results that we live until today. It's worth mentioning that 60% of the world's arms are now bought by Arab countries. Along with the militarization went the wholesale persecution of communities, preeminently but not exclusively the Jewish ones in the Arab world, and of course the Arab ones inside Israel. And this idea of homogenizing societies to create, in the case of Israel, a Jewish state, in the case of the various Arab states, entirely Arab states, whether they're called Syria, Jordan, Egypt, etc., has had the most wasteful and, in my opinion, terrible results, one of the tragedies of the politics of identity which ensued. The expulsion of whole communities as a result of 1948, which set in process a system of distortion within the societies, whether it was inside Israel or in the Arab world, most of it encouraged by U.S. policy at the time, seems to me to have led to every conceivable disaster in the way of human formations and social institutions. Nor was this all. In the name of military security in countries like Egypt, there was a bloody-minded, imponderably wasteful campaign against dissenters, mostly on the left, but independently minded people, too, whose vocation as critics and skilled men and women was brutally terminated in prisons, fatal torture, and summary executions. And as one looks back at those things, in the context of 1948, it's the immense panorama of waste and cruelty that stands out as the immediate result of the war itself. Along with that went a scandalously poor treatment of the refugees themselves. This is a kind of the micro-history of some of the things that Noam was talking about. It's still the case, for example, the 40 to 50,000 Palestinian refugees who are resident in Egypt must report to a local police station every month. Vocational, educational, and social opportunities for them are curtailed, and the general sense of not belonging adheres to them despite their Arab nationality and language. In Lebanon, the situation is worse still. Almost 400,000 Palestinian refugees have had to endure not only the massacres of Sabra, Shatila, Tel Zatar, Bayi, and elsewhere, but have remained confined in hideous quarantine for almost 2 generations. They have no legal right to work in at least 60 occupations. They are not adequately covered by medical insurance. They cannot travel and return. They are objects of suspicion and dislike. In part, they have inherited the mantle of opprobrium draped around them by the PLO's presence there, and thus they remain in the eyes of many ordinary Lebanese, a sort of house enemy to be warded off and or punished from time to time. A similar situation in kind, if not in degree, exists in Syria. As for Jordan, it was, to its credit, the only country where Palestinians were given naturalized status. A visible fault line exists between the disadvantaged majority of Palestinians and the Jordanian establishment. I might add, however, that for most of these situations where Palestinian refugees exist in large groups within one or another Arab country, all of them as a direct consequence of 1948, 51 years ago, no simple, much less elegant or just solution exists in the foreseeable future. It's also worth mentioning, or rather asking, why it is that a destiny of confinement and isolation has been imposed on a people who quite naturally flocked to neighboring countries when driven out of theirs, countries which everyone thought would welcome and sustain them. Inside Israel, the treatment of the Arab minority that was left over, 120,000 that have now become 1 million, a little over 1 million today, Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel. They were subject to military government until 1966. Since that time, they are treated as aliens, although they're citizens of the state, non-Jews in the juridical classification by which Israel tries to be a Jewish state unsuccessfully. And essentially, they live in a state of inferior rights. Much less is spent on their villages, and most important, they are denied fundamental rights like those of immigration and citizenship rights that are enjoyed by Jews outside of Israel. Israel has become unique in the sense that it's the only state in the world that is not the state of its citizens, but the state of the entire Jewish people, which means that roughly 1.2 million of its citizens are somehow inferior, or not somehow, but are definitely inferior. In the occupied territories, to continue this sad litany of the condition of Palestinians, until the Oslo Accords, Palestinians were ruled as an occupied population with great, by the way, I remember, with great admiration by people in this country. I remember in the early 70s, there was a visit to this campus by an Israeli military officer in charge of some aspect of the occupation. And it was a closed seminar, and somehow I wormed my way into it to listen to him say it. And what struck me was the admiration, not to say deference, shown him by faculty members, colleagues of mine in some instances, who were going on about how benign the occupation was and how miraculous it was that Israel was able to rule a population, which it has now ruled for 32 years, with such a small amount of brutality. Well, the fact is, of course, that the brutality has continued in all sorts of ways from the beginning, even after Oslo. To this day, land is continually taken from Palestinians, both inside the occupied territories and inside Israel itself. That is to say, since land is held in trust, 90% of the land, 92% of the land of Israel is held in trust for the Jewish people. Arabs cannot buy land, sell it, or lease it. and their land is continually confiscated. Last fall, for example, the village of al-Fahim, which is the second largest Palestinian village inside Israel, the second largest city, lost approximately 10,000 dunams, which is about 3,000 acres, because Israel unilaterally decided to take them for use as a military target practice area. So this continues all the time. And on the West Bank and Gaza, ruled under military occupation until Oslo, there have been in Gaza about 1,000 laws passed, occupiers' laws, restricting movement, restricting occupations, restricting such things as whether you can plant certain plants or not, whether you can build or not. All aspects of life controlled minutely by the Israeli occupation, 1,400 laws of that sort on the West Bank, creating, in fact, a vast prison. Since Oslo, I'll come back to it in a minute, since Oslo, the situation has gotten worse in ways that I want to describe in a moment. So what happened then after 1948 was the creation, and I want to talk a little bit about the parallelism between the developments inside the Arab world, and particularly as they affected the Palestinians, and the developments inside Israel. There was, of course, in the Arab world a cult of the army, following on the general militarization that I was talking about earlier. This implied that there were only military solutions to political problems, and it was so prevalent a view that it overshadowed the axiom that successful military action had to derive from a motivated, bravely led, and politically integrated and educated force, and this could only issue from a citizen society. Such a desideratum was never the case in the Arab world, rarely practiced or articulated. In addition, there was consolidated a kind of nationalist culture that encouraged rather than mitigated Arab isolation from the rest of the modern world. Israel was soon perceived not only as a Jewish, but as a Western state, which in part it was, and as such was completely rejected even as a suitable intellectual pursuit for those who were interested in finding out about the enemy. And what then developed was a kind of dual system. On the one hand, you had the official Arab position towards Israel, which was rejection, which was, this is the enemy, we have to attack, and so on and so forth. And another system, perfectly typified in that of the Hashemites, but also not limited to them. That is to say, Abdel Nasser, we know, was in contact with the Israelis, searching for terms of peace, really all through the 50s and right up to and certainly after the 67 war. The Hashemites were in constant touch with the Israelis and developed an alliance that was never officially accepted or recognized, but it existed and came into play, as Noam mentioned, in 1970 during the Black September days in the war between the Palestinian resistance movement and the Jordanian army. At the same time, Israel, in its extraordinary and compared to the Arab efforts, far superior efforts at international propaganda, was putting out a tissue of ideological fictions, which were never countered and never properly addressed by the Arabs, so that the rhetorical conflict was a consequence of 1948 and amplified well beyond it anything like anywhere else in the world. For part of the time, it took on some of the vehemence and prominence of the Cold War, which framed it for almost 30 years. What was strange about it is, like the events of 1948 themselves, there was no real Palestinian representation at all until 1967. We were always referred to as the Arabs. And the subsequent, after 67 and the subsequent emergence of the PLO, things began to change. Until then, we were simply known as the Arab refugees who fled because their leaders told them to. Even after some research in the early 60s utterly disputed the validity of those claims and proved the existence of Plan Dalet, which was the Israeli army, or the Haganah, plan to rid Palestine of its inhabitants during the fighting of 1948, in which the aforementioned General Rabin, was responsible for the forced eviction of 60,000 people from the towns of Lid and Ramleh, which now are part of Tel Aviv Airport. So when you go there, you might remember that these used to be Arab cities that were emptied in 1948. These stories about the heroic independence and liberation forces of the Zionists continued to be traded in. Worse yet, those Palestinians who remained behind in Israel after 1948 acquired a solitary status as Israeli Arabs. That's what they were called, shunned by other Arabs, treated by Israeli Jews under a whip, the military administration, and until 1966, stringent emergency laws applied and assigned to them as non-Jews. One of the most unfortunate aspects of this state of affairs is that even the word peace acquires a sinister, uncomfortable meaning for the Arabs at just the time that Israeli publicists used it at every opportunity, as, again, the United States did in formulating this notion of a peace process. The Israelis would constantly appear, people like Abba Eban and others, in the West, saying, "We want peace with the Arabs." And sure enough, the echo went around that Israel fervently desired peace, while the Arabs, ferocious, vengeful, gratuitously bent on violence, did not. In fact, what was at issue, and I want to emphasize this, between Israelis and Palestinians was never peace, but the possibility for Palestinians of restitution of property, nationhood, identity, all of them blotted out by the new Jewish state. Moreover, it appeared to Palestinians that peace with Israel was a form of exterminism that left us without political existence. It meant accepting as definitive and unappealable the events of 1948, the loss of our society and homeland. So even more alienated from Israel and everything it stood for, the whole idea of separation between the two peoples acquired a life of its own, though it meant different things for each. Israelis wanted it in order to live in a purely Jewish state, freed from its non-Jewish residents both in memory and in actuality. Palestinians wanted it as a method for getting back to their original existence as the Arab possessors of Palestine. The logic of separation has operated since 1948 as a persistent motif and has now reached its apogee and its logical conclusion in the hopelessly skewed and unworkable Oslo Accords that are still celebrated by the media and many bien-pensants in this country. At only the very rarest of moments did either Palestinians or Israelis try to think their histories and cultures, inextricably linked for better or for worse, together, contrapuntally, rather than in mutually exclusive terms. The sheer distortion in views both of history and of the future that has resulted is breathtaking and requires some example and analysis now. I don't think anyone can honestly disagree that since 1948, the Palestinians have been the victims, Israelis the victors. No matter how much one tries to dress up or prettify this rather bleak formulation, its truth shines through the murk just the same. The general argument from Israel and its supporters has been that the Palestinians brought it on themselves. Why did they leave? Why did the Arabs declare war? Why did they not accept the 1947 plan of partition? And so on and so on. None of this, it should be clear, justifies Israel's subsequent official behavior, both towards itself and its Palestinian victims, where a hard cruelty, a dehumanizing attitude, and an almost sadistic severity in putting down the Palestinians has prevailed over all the years. The much vaunted Israeli and general Jewish feeling that Israel is in serious peril and that Jews will always be targets of anti-Semitic opportunity, that is buttressed by appeals to the Holocaust, to centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, and to Jewish exiles. This is a potent and in many ways a justifiable sentiment. I've gone on record as saying that it is justified for Jews, even for American Jews whose experiences have been nowhere near as traumatic as their European counterparts, to feel the agonies of the Holocaust as their own, even into the present. But I keep asking myself whether the use of that feeling to keep Palestinians in more or less permanent submission can repeatedly be justified on those grounds alone. And are Netanyahu's intemperate harangues about Israeli security justified, given what a miserable lot has been the Palestinians? Are the huge numbers of soldiers? You must think that in Israel, every young person, man or woman, between the ages of 18 and 25, is required to serve in the army. A lot of that service is policing Palestinians, policing the occupation. Are the huge number of soldiers, the obsessive, excessive measures about terrorism, the endless fencing in? One of the things that struck me when I first went to Israel in 1992 was that every open space, including tennis courts and swimming pools, was surrounded by barbed wire. the interrogations, the legal justification of torture. Israel is the only state, to my knowledge, in the world where torture is legally justified as part of interrogation, including shaking. And I have to tell you from my own experience, I haven't been tortured, but I have to tell you that one of the treatments I had for my illness last summer included as one of its, perhaps the worst of all side effects for me, was what is known as shaking chills, where you shake uncontrollably. And I felt after a few minutes of these shaking chills, which were uncontrollable, that I was going to die. Well, they're regularly used and approved by the Israeli Supreme Court as a way of dealing with quote-unquote Arab suspects, Palestinian suspects. This is part of what exists today within Israel. Does all of this, including the nuclear, biological, and chemical options, the continued discrimination against Israeli Palestinians, the fear and contempt, the bellicosity, one could go on. Are all these things not a sort of massive distortion in perception and mode of life, all of them premised on and fueled by the extreme separatist, not to say xenophobic, sentiment that Israel must remain at all costs an endangered, isolated, unloved Jewish state? Doesn't one have the impression that the language and discourse that have resulted, there are exceptions, of course, not every Israeli is what I'm describing here, but that generally signifies a refusal to engage, the rejection, to engage with a common regional history except on these extreme separatist terms. So what is the situation now? The modern history of the struggle for Palestinian self-determination can be regarded as an attempt to set right the distortions in life and language inscribed so traumatically as a consequence of 48. There's never been any shortage of Palestinian resistance. And while it's true that there have been some advances here and there in Palestinian struggle, the general movement has either been much slower than that of the Zionists, or it has been regressive, and in Lebanon and Jordan, destructive. We must admit these as shameful episodes in our post-1948 national existence. Where the struggle over land is concerned, and that's the essence of the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians, it is the struggle over the territory, over the land of Palestine, which is a tiny place. There has been a net loss, as Israel, through belligerent as well as other means, has asserted its actual hold on more and more of Palestinian land. I speak here, of course, of sovereignty, military power, actual settlement. I contrast that with what I shall call Palestinian symptoms of response, such as the multiple rhetorical attempts to assert the existence of a Palestinian state, which Chairman Arafat is going around the world trying to do now, to bargain with Israel over conditions of Israeli security, and the general untidiness, sloppiness, and carelessness, the absence of preparations, the absence of maps and files, fact and figures amongst Palestinian negotiators in the Oslo process that have characterized what could only be called a lack of seriousness in dealing with the real as opposed to the rhetorical conditions of dispossession. These have been imposed on us by the current peace process. These multiply the distortions stemming from the original condition of loss and dispossession. Rather than rectifications, they offer additional dislocations and the reproduction of distortions whose widening effects extend the whole range from war to increasing numbers of refugees, more property abandoned and taken, more frustration, more anger, more humiliation, and so on. To all this, one can add the force of Rosemary Sayer's startlingly appropriate and even shattering phrase, too many enemies. But its poignancy is that Palestinians have, by a further dialectical transformation, become their own enemies through often unsuccessful negotiation and violence. The peace process, I want to conclude with this reflection, the peace process has accelerated the process of separation between Palestinians and Israelis. Of course, that hasn't happened. That is an illusory situation because, in fact, the two populations have now become more intermixed through Jewish settlement, through Israeli Jewish settlement on the occupied territories, so that today 40% of Gaza is still controlled by Israeli settlements in the heart of Gaza, and approximately 97% of the West Bank is also controlled by Israeli troops and settlers. In a condition of this sort, the only way to describe what has occurred, the attempt at separation, is what has to be called apartheid. That there is one population with sovereignty, namely, this is all a result of Oslo, this is all part of the American-sponsored peace process, about which I've written and spoken millions of times, but I can go into the details of it if you'd like, impose them on a Palestinian leadership that has been anxious, alas, since the Gulf War, to remain in power and, in effect, sell out its people for this remaining in power. Israel, as a result of the peace process, controls the borders, so that even Gaza, which is the largest area of Palestinian land under Palestinian autonomy or self-government, whatever you want to call it, is surrounded by barbed wire and an Israeli fence. People landing at the Palestinian airport in Gaza, which was greeted with such jubilation, as a form of further humiliation, are forced to leave the plane, bust from the airport to Rafah in the south, which is on the border between Egypt and Israel. They go through customs there, then they're brought back to the airport to enter, quote-unquote, the Palestinian territories. Arafat, in order to leave Gaza, has to request permission from the Israeli authorities. Most of the time, the territories are closed. Palestinians cannot go across the lines. And when we were in Gaza a couple of weeks ago, we happened to be leaving Gaza at the time that the workers who go from Gaza to Israel proper to work were coming in. And to suggest that what they have to go through is what cattle have to go through chutes and prods and, of course, passes, as in the passes of South African apartheid, is to minimize the humiliation and the suffering of 70,000 people who have to go to Israel to work. The settlements are taking more land from Palestinians, and, of course, Jerusalem, which was annexed in 1967, has now become a gigantic megalopolis that it accounts for roughly 25% of the West Bank, where now Palestinians are slowly being driven out in a process of what is called Judaization. In such a situation, I think it's important to understand that any attempt at separation through the establishment of a Palestinian state, through these little Bantustans which have been established, I think is futile, cannot work. And that's why I think the notion of a binational state, where there is self-determination for both peoples, is the only feasible solution. Remark also that in about 10 years, let us say by the year 2010, there will be demographic parity between the two populations. There will be as many Palestinians as there are Jews now in the land of historical Palestine. That includes Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied territories, and Israel. And instead of pursuing this policy fueled by the United States of trying to maintain Israeli domination and hegemony through collaborationist regimes like the Arafat regime and keeping the Palestinians down, there is, I think, the opening towards a solution based on binational self-determination beginning to take root in the territories, in the Israeli community, Israeli Jewish community, and certainly amongst many other Palestinians. I want to simply conclude by saying that in such a situation, given the realities of the great power configurations which dominate the lives of small people, it becomes even more important, I think, to dwell upon the need for developing a critical intellectual consciousness that refuses the pat solutions, the programmed packaging and distorting fictionalization of reality that people practicing the politics of identity have resorted to. The only way out, I think, is resistance, intellectual, beginning with intellectual resistance, the organization of civil institutions, as is beginning to happen now between Israeli Jews and Palestinians and elsewhere throughout the world where these exile communities exist, and the constant formulating and reformulating of a genuine solution to the problem by looking critically and realistically and courageously at the past. Thank you.
One suggested that we should go straight to questions.
So the question is, both of you agree there should be a binational state, but has there been in the past support for that? And could the Israeli Jews feel confidence that there would be a, since a political developments that will provide the foundation for binational states. In view of the present situation, as we see Czechoslovakia disintegrating, and its nationalism is sharpening, and nationalities now, as in Yugoslavia or the Azerbaijanis, and everywhere nationalism is now sharpening. In view of these developments all over the world, why do you think there is a basis for a commemoration of a Jewish Arab state?
You're absolutely right that, first of all, I think that that the question of security of Israeli Jews, while not insignificant, is the least of the questions. They hold overwhelming power. The question is one of the security of the Palestinians. As for what Columbia students may have said, I can't tell you, but you know better than I, but the PLO did have a position. It was their official representative. It supported the January 1976 Security Council resolution, which I mentioned. They may have forgotten that they supported it, but in fact they did. That called for a two-state settlement, including all territorial and security guarantees to the State of Israel, in accord with UN 242. By the early 1980s, the PLO was again officially making offers for some kind of a two-state settlement which would guarantee all of Israel's rights. As I mentioned, the New York Times wouldn't report it. In fact, wouldn't even allow letters to appear referring to it. But it's on the record. I don't think that what is on paper is all that important, to tell you the truth. It seems to me what's important is the relations among the people, the balance of forces, and so on. And if the people of the region come to understand, as I think they should, that this is very much in their common interests, there's certainly a basis for it. As to the problems of multinational states, you're absolutely right. They have all kinds of problems, but they pale into total insignificance in comparison with the problems of actual states. So take just the history of Europe over the last, couple hundred years, 1,000 years, and it's the most bloody area of the world, where the highest goal of members of each state was to massacre the guys across the border. And the only reason this came to an end in 1945 is that they all came to understand that they had created measures of destruction so awesome, that the next time French and Germans decided to slaughter one another, it was going to be the end of the world. So since then, there's what the scholars like to call peace among democratic states, meaning they had reached the point where they're going to slaughter everything, they're going to destroy everything the next time they play the game they've been playing for the last hundreds of years. So it's perfectly true. The history of multinational states, which is essentially all states, is often internally ugly, but it's incomparably better than the history of relations among actual states. And within the always existing multinational states, because it's almost always what they are, we're a little misled in the United States. The United States is unusual because it's sort of homogeneous. And the reason it's homogeneous is that the European invaders just wiped everyone out. So it ended up being homogeneous. But that's not the way most of the world is. I mean, if you go through Europe, everything that's called a state is actually multinational, with very complicated regional, cultural, ethnic breakdowns of one sort or another. A lot of them work pretty well. A lot of them don't work so well. But again, the record is far better than the record of states. States is essentially a European invention in a modern sense, and the record is horrendous.
But about your point concerning the origins of Israel, the problem actually didn't begin with the death camps. It began earlier. From the point of view of Palestinians, that is to say, the Zionist movement began its incursions into Palestine in the late 19th century, 50 years before World War II. And the ideology was always one of conquest. And if you look at the record, if you look at some of the remarks made by Zionist leaders of the time, there's no doubt that could be left in your mind that what they were talking about was colonialism, in the sense that these were natives. The British had given them the territory. The natives didn't know how to use the land. They were nomads. They were at a stage of lesser development. And more important than any of that, they knew perfectly well. There's a remark that Ben-Gurion made in 1944. He said that there's been no instance in history where a people will give up its land for another people. It just doesn't happen. So they knew there was going to be a conflict. And of course, it was exacerbated by the Holocaust and what happened in World War II and so on. But the question, of course, that everyone asks is why, in the end, must Palestinians pay for this? And there's no answer to that. You can't, there's no logic that says that because of what happened to Jews in Christian Western Europe has to be paid for by a bunch of Palestinians who happen to be in the land that is described as Israel's by sovereign right or the Bible and so on. In the first place, this is very important. In the first place, the history of that land is not exclusively a Jewish history. I mean, this is one of the greatest myths perpetuated, it seems to me, in the last 50 or 100 years. For example, the notion of 3,000 years of Jewish history. Well, there are lots of other histories in Palestine. One can think of the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Jebusites, the Philistines, the Byzantines, the Arabs, and so on and so forth. In that history, which is a multicultural, of course it's a history of conquest, but it's a multi-ethnic, pluralistic history of many, many peoples. It doesn't go without saying historically that the dominant history of that country is essentially Jewish. That's number one. Number two, in the 50 years of its founding, again, I don't want to take on what Arab students may have told you in 1983 and what they didn't tell you. I wasn't there, so I can't vouch for it. But here's a fact that in 1999, the question is it the case that Israel is more accepted, is more at home in a region which is predominantly Arab and Islamic? I think the answer is no. First of all, Israel is itself not a homogeneous place, despite the attempts to turn it into a Jewish state by some of the methods I described earlier, including ethnic cleansing, of a very severe kind, which hasn't yet been recognized, hasn't been recognized very widely. But the point is, what are you going to do about the number of Palestinians continues to increase and continues to assert itself? And the same question can be posed to Palestinians who say, we want our land back. Now, according to law within Israel, the law of return entitles every Jew to citizenship in Israel. Now, according to international law, applied today to the Kosovars, is that all refugees have a right of return. Now, there is a kind of mutual incompatibility there. I don't think there's any way of minimizing this. That the Palestinian history of dispossession is contradicted by the history of Israeli conquest. Now, what do you do in this circumstance? Can you, in fact, separate the two? The land is too small. The fact is that now Palestinians and Jews, Israeli Jews, are more intertwined than they've ever been in their history. Is there any way to cut the land up in such a way as to make it into two separate states? I think what you would create there is a far greater problem precisely by movements of people, by forced evictions, more dispossession and more dislocation, than the other solution, which the answer to your question is there any other solution? I don't think there is. I think the only way has to be an attempt to find a practical way to allow two peoples to lead their lives with a maximum of political freedom in the same place. And that includes, of course, education. It requires a new style of looking at the history of the conflict and the future of the conflict, which is not easily available now. But as I said, there are movements, there are attempts, there are institutions, there are visions beginning now to develop because of the poverty of the present peace process, which lend one some hope for the binational idea.
I just wanted to make a comment and then ask a question, because I think that, it was laid out very well how U.S. policy in the Middle East has only brought death and destruction. I mean, number one, the attempt to sweep the Palestinian question under the rug with the so-called the fake peace process, and also with the fact that, currently U.S. sanctions are strangling an entire nation in Iraq, and that country continues to be bombed. In fact, the UN, reports that 7,000 Iraqi children die a month as a result of the sanctions, and that's why I wanted to just turn to the bombing, the U.S. and NATO bombing of Kosovo, because I feel like, clearly U.S. policy in the Middle East hasn't been humanitarian, right? What are we supposed? our intelligence is almost insulted when the administration tries to convince us that somehow, the U.S. government takes on a different character when it goes and bombs Yugoslavia. It seems to me if they were so concerned about, humanitarianism, if they were so concerned about the Albanians, why don't the NATO countries open their borders to the refugees? Why doesn't the U.S. spend what it spends on one B-2 bomber, $2 billion, to basically allow people to live in decent dwellings instead of an exposure along the borders? And so that's why I feel like in order to actually fight against the devastation in the Middle East that U.S. imperialism has brought, it's necessary to build an anti-war movement, in this country against what's happening, a war on Yugoslavia, which ordinary Serbians and ordinary Albanians, I think, have nothing to gain. And actually, there's a teach-in, which is going to be this Tuesday, on the important. It's a confusing issue. And I know, the question is, I know both Edward Said and Noam Chomsky have come out against the war, have made statements, and I would like to hear what you have to say about the war in this situation.
Look, I don't want to give a whole thing on the current situation in Yugoslavia, but a number of things need to be said. In the first place, obviously, I tried to emphasize this in my talk. I see the evils of ethnic cleansing and forced dispossession, which is taking place by the forces of Serbia under Milosevic. And there's obviously a parallel there between what happened to Palestinians in 1948. And I certainly want also to add, since you talked about Iraq, that there can be no grief at all for what Saddam Hussein has wrought on the people of Iraq and the neighborhood. But one should remember that these are not things that happened out of context and just suddenly discovered the monstrosity of these regimes. Saddam was supported very, very methodically during the 80s, especially during the Iran-Iraq war by the United States and the European powers. And Milosevic was always involved. The Dayton Accord made a point of really sort of sidelining the Bosnians and dealing with Milosevic and the Kosovars, of course. So the policy now of bombing has to be seen in the context of U.S. moves elsewhere. That is to say, at the same time that this action is taking place, a kind of clean war, a safe war, no U.S. pilots hurt, etc., with these smart bombs and so on and so forth, devastation of a country. There is a war being waged by a NATO ally, Turkey, against the Kurds. 46,000 Kurds have been killed, and not a word has been said about this by the United States, which simply tolerates it. I think these false dichotomies, either you're with, as it used to be said during the Gulf War, either you're for fascism or you're for imperialism. You have to be for imperialism because it's always slightly better than fascism, and fascism is these are the kind of false dichotomies we're placed into at the current moment, and I think that the net result, again, without any particular plan, without any notion of what's going to be done afterwards, given the history of other refugees in the last 50 years, it seems unlikely that this action on the part of NATO and the United States is going to produce anything except more destruction and more fragmentation and dispossession, and probably at the end Clinton will walk away and say you have a success.
Well, I'll be brief. I think the first thing we ought to do when facing this, it's a difficult and complicated issue, but the first thing we at least ought to agree is to be honest. If we don't want to be honest, then let's just stop the discussion. If we're willing to be honest, we see instantly that it cannot possibly be an operation resulting from humanitarian concerns. That's just trivial. Let's take the one example that Edward mentioned, in which, incidentally, I disagree with him. He said that the U.S. ignored the Turkish atrocities in Kurdistan, which is absolutely untrue. He agrees, I'm sure. The U.S. worked as hard as it could to escalate those atrocities. In fact, this is not ancient history. Atrocities in southeastern Turkey, which are well beyond Kosovo, peaked in 1994. It was a peak year of atrocities. It was also the peak year of U.S. provision of weapons under Clinton to Turkey that included jet planes, napalm, anti-personnel weapons, tanks, tanks, all of which were used. In fact, Turkey became the biggest importer of weapons in the world, thanks to the huge supply of weapons that Clinton was offering them to consummate a destruction and massacre, which unfortunately is well beyond what's happening in Kosovo, or had happened. Remember, 2,000 people were killed there last year, according to NATO. And in fact, Clinton even had to evade congressional restrictions. Human rights groups found that U.S. jets were being used illegally to bomb Kurds, and the humanitarian Clinton had to find ways of evading those restrictions to allow the jet planes to keep going, to keep bombing Kurds. So that's just one example of many. There's no possibility that this is a humanitarian operation. That leaves us with the question whether you should carry it out. Okay, separate question. So now you look and see. Where were we on March 24th when the bombing started? Well, there, according to NATO, had been 2,000 people killed in the past year as Serbians responded brutally to KLA attacks on police stations and so on. And so you might ask yourself how the United States would respond to attacks on police stations in New York by a guerrilla group being supported by, say, Libya and based across the border. I'll just put that aside. But in any event, the response was brutal. A couple thousand people were killed, 200,000 refugees. On March 24th, the way the situation stood was, well, I actually learned something interesting in the New York Times yesterday, hidden down at the bottom of a column. A place where it's usually useful to begin reading. It turns out, I didn't know this before, that the Serbian parliament had called for, before the bombing, had called for UN forces to be in Kosovo as observers, whereas the U.S. was insisting on NATO forces. Well, that's consistent with U.S. contempt for and hatred for the United Nations or any other international institution, but it does put a rather different cast on the situation. There were clearly negotiating opportunities and options that could be pursued. The U.S. picked one option. It was an option which was guaranteed, practically, to make the situation far worse. I want to express my opinion. Let me just quote the U.S. NATO commander. On March 26th, Wesley Clark, 2 days after the bombing started, he said, in his words, it was entirely predictable that as a result of the bombing, there would be a vast escalation of Serbian atrocities on the ground. Well, you know, entirely predictable is too strong. The world isn't that simple. Nothing's entirely predictable. But it was certainly pretty obvious that they were going to react somehow, and they were going to react where they have strength. Well, they don't have strength in the air. They have strength on the ground. So they were going to react the way they did, you know, by sharply increasing the attacks and so on. If you look at the number of refugees, the UN had registered 0 refugees in Albania and Macedonia. There were some, but they weren't registered by the UN as of March 26th, in fact. That's when the refugee flow started. It's after the bombing. The effects of the bombing, rather predictably, not entirely predictably, as the NATO general stated, rather predictably were to sharply increase the damage to the populations, the harm to the populations, very severely, all populations. Other effects were to wipe out a very promising and courageous democratic movement in Belgrade, which was the best hope for getting rid of this gangster Milosevic with whom we'd be dealing. It's having, I mean, everyone rallies around the flag, you know, just the way we would do if New York started getting bombed. So that's gone, at least for the moment, maybe forever. The very harsh effects in the surrounding regions. There was yet another attack on the system of international law and world order. Well, like if you're Saddam Hussein, you don't take this very seriously, but maybe not everybody accepts the standards of Saddam Hussein. Maybe there's some people who think that we ought to have some sort of regime of international order which provides at least some support for the weak. Doesn't provide any support for the strong. They don't need it. But it provides some, the restrictions against the use of force provide some protection for the weak. Okay, we have another blow against that. In fact, across the board, it's a disaster. It's a human disaster. In fact, forgetting even the possibility that this would have had humanitarian motives, which of course it didn't, we have to ask what it meant. Well, that's approximately what it meant. It doesn't look very much in doubt. And it looks as if there were alternatives. And there still are alternatives, as there always are. In fact, let me just put the whole thing at a kind of mundane level. Like, suppose you walk out in the street this evening and you see a crime being committed. You know, somebody's robbing someone else. Well, you have three choices. One choice is to try to stop it. You know, like maybe call 911 or something. Another choice is to do nothing. A third choice is to pick up an assault rifle and kill them both, and kill the bystander at the same time. Well, suppose you do that, and somebody says, well, you know, why'd you do that? And I said, look, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. You know? I mean, is that a response? You know? If you can think of nothing that wouldn't do harm, then do nothing. You know? And the same is true magnified in international affairs, apart from the fact that there were things that could have been done.
But I want to add one other thing, if I may, that is, at the same time that this war is going on, the United States is continuing to bomb Iraq, again on the bottom pages of the New York Times. And I think one of the things, one of the demonstrations, I think, behind the action in Yugoslavia is a kind of projection of U.S. power and the assertion that the U.S. can fight regional wars, more than one, maybe 2, 3, 4 at a time. And interestingly, one of your favorite columnists, John Friedman, the other day was saying in the New York Times that it's a sort of repetition of some of the tactics used during the Indo-Chinese episode. That is to say, to appear as irrational as possible. And he was advocating the unreasonable use of force, in other words, just for the sake of the force, not to achieve any particular results, but to show the people who is boss. And I think that mentality is very much part of it. And the second point to be made is the continued attack upon the United Nations. That is to say, the United Nations is useful in Iraq. You know, they can use resolutions that the United States pushed through. Continued arrears in views, the continued scorn for attempts at peacemaking and so on and so forth, as in Rwanda in 1994. But essentially the United Nations is a contemptible body, and as most people in the Senate and the House boast, they've never been out of the United States, don't even have a passport. So why should we care about the world body that that tries to take sovereignty away from the United Nations? I think that's also part of it. That it's an assertion of world number one without much interest at all in any possible outcome that anyone could possibly see is anything but bleak.
If I can just, I guess we should leave it here. Let me just say that on this matter of looking irrational, Thomas Friedman didn't make it up. That's official U.S. policy.
It is, yeah.
There is a national defense, I forget the name of it, in 1995, which proposed that, can partially be classified, which proposed that the United States should maintain an irrational posture. We should look like a dangerous, irrational state, because that will frighten people. And we should use the nuclear arsenal that way. The more uncertain they are, the more power we have. Now, there's actually an Orwellian phrase for this, which is repeated by Clinton and his little puppy dog, Tony Blair, and Madeleine Albright, and everyone else. The phrase is, we have to preserve the credibility of NATO. That's the main argument that's given. Well, try to decode that. I mean, are they worried about the credibility of Denmark, or of Italy? No. Credibility of NATO means credibility of the United States. Now, what does credibility mean? Well, credibility means like what any mafia don would understand. If somebody doesn't pay, what they're supposed to do in a grocery store, the don has to maintain credibility. Other people have to understand that you don't do this. Credibility means to be frightened of the enforcer. And that, once you carry out the translation, I think you can see what's going on. I think it's exactly what David said. That's a major motivation. You have to preserve the credibility of the enforcer. And if you do it by being irrational and violent and destructive, well, that's where the cookie crumbles.
I have a tiny footnote to this. To bring it back to the Middle East, I mean, it's the rationale for Israeli policy in Lebanon. Yeah, where you occupy a strip of land, you say this is to protect yourself, so you occupy more land inside another sovereign state, and then you mete out punishment through mercenaries, but certainly it's by the clean bombing, the use of aircraft and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when you meet resistance, you call them terrorists. And what's interesting is how the U.S. press has followed along with this logic, so that whenever they talk about the Hezbollah guerrillas in southern Lebanon fighting the Israeli occupation, they always refer to it as Iran-supported terrorists, Hezbollah, and so on and so forth. But the footnote I wanted actually to bring attention to was around just before the middle of March. It must have been around the 11th or 12th of March. The Israelis invaded further north. They took another area in a town called Anun, just north of the security zone in southern Lebanon. And they surrounded it. They took the village. This kicked out most of the inhabitants and put barbed wire around it. A couple of days later, there were big demonstrations in Beirut, and a bunch of students came down from Beirut by bus to Arnoun in South Lebanon, to this newly occupied town north of the Israeli zone, but which was just recently occupied by the Israelis. And they stood in front of the barbed wire, warned off. The Israelis shot rifles in the air, warned that the wires were full of electricity, that there were landmines and so on and so forth. And then, as it happens in situations of crowds and so on, a couple of them, of the Lebanese students, attacked the barbed wire, which of course was not wired, there were no landmines, and liberated the town. And the Israeli soldiers, with all their arms, ran away. It's a small episode in a generally not very distinguished history of conflict, but it does show at times that the bully can be confronted.
It's a great shame, but George Steele tells me we have to stop. So will you please join me in thanking Noam Chomsky and Said?